In part 1, we stripped Welven's chassis of parts in the front, removed the engine, gutted the interior and were left with a bare shell ready for structural modification to accommodate the new Rolls Royce Viper 535 power plant. In this episode, we do a small amount of cutting to the chassis in order to fit it. Okay, bit of a different format, given the fact that I was in a bit of a rush when we were making this and putting it together, so I don't have a lot of actual video footage of me building the car up to the point you can see now. So what I'm going to do instead is talk through what I've done on the car. First of all, this is the current state of the car. Engine in. Just working on getting the seat installed, so that's just placed in there at the minute, not actually screwed down. And then it's basically as I took it to the show. So I got the bonnet installed, it's a fiberglass bonnet, wheels on with brakes painted, and all the suspension components. But I'm going to talk through all of that and the process and show you some pictures of how I got on with that. Okay, so first thing we needed to do was create some access at the back of the car. Obviously all the bulkheads still in place at that point, so I thought I'd start at the back and work my way in. As you can see, I've drilled all of the spot welds off, all around both sides, and also, well, when the boot floor was in there was spot welds all along the bottom as well, and I've retained that rear panel here. I do intend on putting that back on eventually. I want to make it so that the rear end of the car looks complete, looks like an MR2, but I needed to make sure where I was putting the engine would work first, and also, I didn't want to start cutting something until it's finally in place and in the right position, so it didn't make sense for me to do that at the start. So I've just left that for now, and I'll come back to that later when I come to put it all together and make it look nice at the end. Next thing was the rear window. So the rear window on the rear of these cars, nice curved piece of glass, quite easy to break, but given where I was putting the engine, I didn't feel confident that I really wanted it in there. I did think about putting a Perspex one in and just kind of cutting it so that it would clear the engine, but I don't really think it's necessary to have it in. It's not a road car, so I've just taken it out. I didn't particularly enjoy taking that out, as you can see from this picture, but yeah. With those two bits out of the way, I then wanted to start tackling the removal of the boot, the bulkhead between the boot and the engine compartment, and then finally the bulkhead between the engine compartment and the cabin. But before I started cutting any of that, I was really concerned about the chassis moving and twisting. Obviously I'm cutting quite a lot of structure out of the car, and I didn't want the chassis to be twisting at all. So before I did anything else, I made this cross brace here and installed it. I had a rough guess and a rough measure of where I thought the engine would be, and made this to suit, and as you can see it clears the engine quite well. Whether or not I keep that brace in there or change it for a common aftermarket one, I don't know. I might leave this one in here because it serves purpose well. But yes, that was just a measure to stop the chassis from twisting while I was cutting all of the stuff out. Once that was out of the way, I decided to install a roll hoop. So I procured this roll hoop here from another vehicle. Actually, I have another MR2 track one, and I repurposed this one for use in mine. As you can see, I've mounted it in the location where it made most sense to, just so that it's covered by the B pillars there. Now, at the point when I was installing that, I had still intended on mounting the engine quite a lot further rearwards than it is now. I still wasn't entirely sure where the engine was going to end up. Now that didn't, as you can see, it's a lot further forward than what I'd planned. But at this point, I hadn't yet determined where it was going to sit exactly, and I just wanted to, get the roll hoop in. I knew it was going to be required to add some strength back into the chassis. So I just put it there in the place where that made most sense. And then I had intended originally on creating some mount points for the engine within the engine original engine bay of the car, and that would have mounted up on these points here, one on the left side there, and then on the driver's side there's that other mount point there. That didn't end up happening, and you'll see why a little bit later. Sticking with chassis rigidity, the other thing that I did as well is, normally in these two rear, the ends of the chassis rails here, you would have, I think there's one here actually, you would have these parts that support the rear crash bar, and obviously because I was taking that out, and I was removing all of the support between the two other than the subframe, I did actually decide to make a crossbar. So here's that component here. It actually turned out, I think, to be unnecessary, but at the time I really didn't want any of the chassis moving. I wasn't sure how stiff it was going to be with all of the bulkheads cut out, so I made that, put that in there, just to bridge the gap between the two and act as a bit of extra support to stop the two rails from spreading apart. Again, ultimately I didn't really think that was necessary, so I'm not running it at the moment. I don't think it will come back. You'll see from the pictures that you're looking at that when I originally made it, it was a straight bar that went between the two. I did actually modify it after the fact to dip down. I wanted it to go underneath with a view that I didn't want it to interfere with the jet pipe. So as you can see, the engine does come below that point, so I would have needed to clear that somehow, and at the time as well I was still planning on mounting the engine centrally within the car, rather than offset, as you can see now. So it's got quite a big offset to the left, which is why I made this with a central dip in it. Another reason why I probably won't end up running this is that that's now in the wrong place and would need complete rework if I wanted to run it, but I actually don't think it's necessary, so I'm going to leave it off. In the last video you would have seen the subframe had a hole in it, and I didn't know at the time whether or not I was going to be repairing it or replacing it. I did end up actually repairing it. The internal structure of these, it's not as simple as just this outer metal. There was some internal structure as well that kind of comes up at a 45-degree angle, that was also completely corroded. So I've made that hole bigger. I cut it all the way out, as you can see here, all the way out to this point here. Folded that back, same here, folded that back. I've addressed all of the rust inside, remade the internal structure, and then I've welded it all back up and also given it a lick of paint. So that is the same subframe that came on the car, but it's just been refurbished slightly. Okay, then with the subframe reinstalled, it's time to start chopping out. So you'll see some pictures here. I started off with the boot and the boot bulkhead. So the two surfaces would have ran here and then up this line here. Ended up chopping those out. Reciprocating saw and angle grinder, made really short work of that. It didn't take, well, I think it took me 10 minutes total. I just did a rough cut to begin with, just so that I get the bulk of the material out of the way. Moving forwards, the bulkhead from the engine compartment into the cabin, before I cut that, because it did contain the main, one of the main strength points on the chassis, which is this, the bottom of the bulkhead is a very thick folded piece of steel, a multi-layer one, and that adds a lot of strength along the bottom of the car. Before I chop that, I wanted to add some additional strength, so that's again a recurring theme. Where this strengthening tube is here, actually runs through where the old tunnel was, and you'll see some pictures of that. So I cut a slot in the tunnel and welded this. This is welded directly to the chassis rail. Excuse my welding, it's not the best in the world, but it's strong enough. And that really did tie those two chassis rails together. And once that was installed, I then went at the bulkhead again. Didn't take long to cut that out with the reciprocating saw and the angle grinder. Now the goal at this point was just to create enough of a gap for me to test fit the engine and offer it up to the car, just to see where it would sit. So I only cut a small amount of the bulkhead out. I didn't cut it all the way back. Again, I was still planning on mounting this centrally at the time, so I just cut enough just to get the engine in. One thing I was very careful of is not to cut too far over this side. So I mentioned that part offers quite a lot of strength. Sorry, it's focusing on my hand. that offered quite a lot of strength to the rear of the car, and you can see just in the end there is the start of another kind of strength plate, another piece of folded steel, and that's supporting these suspension components here. So these control arms underneath the car that run back to well, the suspension arm, I didn't want to cut too close to them, obviously because that would be bad if that moved. It is welded to the chassis rail, so it's unlikely that it'd move a lot, but I did end up stopping the cut there. It wasn't really necessary to cut much further than that anyway, because the bottom of the engine does curve, so the widest point would be kind of at the middle. But yeah, I was very careful not to cut into that structure. With that bulkhead cut out, the only thing left that was stopping me from putting the engine in was the tunnel. So in the middle of the MR2 there's the tunnel, which you'll see in the pictures that I'll put up on the screen, where the fuel tank is underneath the car, that runs the full length from well, basically from the front bulkhead to the rear bulkhead. That also needed to come out. I did end up chopping it kind of halfway, thinking again that I was only going to put the engine, well, not as far forward as I have, and I ended up then chopping out the whole thing all the way up to the bulkhead, and flat plating the whole floor, which you'll see in a short while. But with all that out the way, it was time to offer the engine up to the car. Okay, so the engine when it arrived was on a transit frame, big yellow thing, which was too big to kind of offer the engine up to the car, even though I did put it on casters. So I then ended up deciding to make my own custom frame for the engine that was kind of a bit slimmer, very basic. It's actually made out of an old metal pallet that I've repurposed, just box section steel, some casters welded together, and then the 2 points that the engine sits on. So it's a really good point to actually talk about the engine mounting. So the engine actually sits on these 2 mount points, and these connect to the main trunnion, which is this round part in the middle that attaches to the engine. Now, all of the weight of the engine and all of the thrust that's produced by the engine goes through those 2 points, which seems like really bonkers, but you know, that's how it's designed. That's how it would have been in the aircraft. It would have been supported on 2 points. The third point just stops the engine from tilting, so I've added that at the front. As you can see, that just supports the engine and stops it from rocking. It will actually pivot on these 2 mounts. It's not, you know, constrained from tilting in pitch this way, so you can actually rotate it around on that. One thing as well with these engines is they're actually incredibly well balanced. This here is what the maintenance manual describes as the lifting point for the engine, which looks really flimsy, but this is where you lift the engine from, and as you can see from the pictures, when it's lifted, it's almost perfectly balanced front to rear, and this is approximately where the centre of gravity is for the engine. With the main trunnion being just behind that, the engine does tend to tilt forwards, so the point at the front is supporting the engine from not dipping down this way, and it's actually holding it upright. And with it removed off the yellow transit frame that it arrived on, it was just a matter of manoeuvring the new frame underneath it, dropping it on and bolting it down, and you know, it's lived on this stand ever since, which is really good because it actually takes up less space. With that, it's just a case of I pushed it between the chassis rails just to offer it up to the car and see kind of how it would look inside the car. I ended up actually removing most of the bracing, including the subframe. I thought at that point that, you know, well, if the chassis does move, all this bracing will pull it back into place once I bolt it back up. But actually, the chassis, whether it's the extra bracing that I added with the bar at the bottom or the hoop, I didn't actually detect any noticeable movement in the chassis whatsoever, and all the bolts for all this bracing went straight back in with no drama. So, you know, maybe I didn't give the chassis enough credit. Now, with the engine kind of mocked up in a rough position, 2 things became very apparent. One was with the engine in the centre of the car, there'd have been absolutely no room for a seat, which drove the decision to move the engine offset to one side. Now a lot of people say, well, won't this make the car really unstable because the thrust's going to be offset? Truthfully, it's so close to the centre line of the car that any yaw component introduced by the engine is so minimal that you won't even notice it. I did also consult with some other jet car builders, and they basically said the same. It doesn't matter if the engine's offset as long as it's parallel and facing straight down the centre of the car and not tilted off at an angle like this. As long as it's straight down the centre of the car, it can be offset left or right, and it won't make a noticeable difference to the handling of the car whatsoever. The second thing that became apparent was I wasn't going to be able to put the engine as far back as I wanted. I originally wanted to put the main trunnion of the engine approximately here, but as you see from the pictures, that would have meant that this section of the engine would have been already out of the back of the car. Now there is another piece to go on here that I don't have, the jet pipe, which has the nozzle on it, which creates a little bit more thrust. If I added that on, it would have been 2 or 3 meters past the end of the car, which would have been ridiculous. Also, if I ever want to put an afterburner on the car, that's also going to have to live in a section behind the existing portion of the engine. So it became really apparent that I needed to shove the engine as far forward as I possibly could. And it just so happened that the approximate position where I wanted to put it was in line with where I'd already put the roll hoop and the brace between the chassis rails. So as you can see, that's where it ended up, and I've since tied that in with some additional supports up to the roll hoop there. Now that did mean the rest of the tunnel had to come out. So as I said before, I needed to remove all of the tunnel all the way up to the bulkhead, into the frunk, which I think you can see in the pictures. The other thing as well at this point, because of how much of the tunnel I decided to cut out, it's my cat helping again, because of how much I decided to cut out, the handbrake mechanism, I ended up deciding that I was going to remove it, because the handbrake lever normally would live on the tunnel and be mounted to the tunnel. There was no way I was able to keep that with the new position of the engine, so I just decided I was going to remove the entire handbrake system. Usually it would have 2 cables that run, one to this side and one to this side, with a kind of yoke in the middle to split the force between the two. I figured trying to keep that intact was a bit of a waste of time. I don't really need a handbrake. What I've decided instead is eventually I will use a hydraulic line lock for the rear brakes, just so that if I do need to stop the car from rolling at any point, I can do that hydraulically rather than using the cable handbrake mechanism. One thing I did keep is the plate that the handbrake mechanism was mounted on. With me cutting all of the tunnel out, the floor pan became extremely floppy, because I took all of the bracing out as well, which meant the floor pan didn't have a lot of structure, so I left that plate in just because it was a convenient mounting point that tied the two sides together. So that's pretty much the rear dealt with, which brings us to the front. There we go. So obviously with the engine inside the car there, it needs some airflow. So first thing I did was cut out the front bulkhead and create some space for some air to come into the cabin. I then also started to cut out the front just to investigate that rust. So the rust was along here, and I decided to start cutting that back just to investigate and see how bad it was. And I did originally only cut out a small amount of this. I wasn't entirely sure what was structural and what wasn't, and what provided the rigidity. You can see there's this main front subframe. Well, it's not a subframe because you can't remove it, but this member at the front does tie the chassis rails together, and that provides the majority of the structure up front. So once I kind of cut this back, I decided then just to cut all of it out, The main bit I was worried about was the support for the steering rack. Now that was plated, there was a sheet across the top of that. I wasn't sure whether or not it was the sheet that was supporting the rack, or whether or not the rack mounts were supporting the sheet. Turns out the rack mounts are providing majority of the support, so these two pieces here are more than strong enough to hold the steering rack without the support of that top sheet. So once I determined that, I basically cut it all out. So this is all now open for airflow, and as is the front. Okay, so with some help from Jasper, I'm going to explain as well the rust at the front. Unfortunately, where it was, it's at these 2 points where it supports the front suspension arms. So I didn't really feel like I could justify just patching that up. So what I ended up doing instead was cutting all of that out, and thought I'd come up with something else. You can see what solution I ended up going with, but that will be covered in the next episode. With all of this cut out, what I ended up then doing is just giving it all a really good clean. Obviously there's grinding dust everywhere, dirt, so I power washed the entire thing, and then once that had dried, I etch primed all of the surfaces that I touched with the angle grinder. So all of the bare metal surfaces I etch primed, and then I've covered it over with some colour matched 746 turquoise pearl. Just thought it would look neater if I used the right colour. So that's what we've ended up with here. Okay, with that we conclude the cutting required to the chassis. I put some pictures in here. I did end up going back to the rear and tidying up the welds, making them more flush, doing some deburring, etc., and then giving it a coat of the colour match paint. So that's it for the cutting section. In the next part we're going to look at reassembling the suspension and putting all of that back together so that it's ready to go to Jap Show finale. I appreciate this episode has been a little bit of a slideshow with me talking in the background, but I had to do something to make up for the lack of footage. Future episodes will include more live action while I'm actually doing the job. But what did you think of this episode? Let me know in the comments. If you did happen to enjoy it, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.